One of the more compelling TV shows I've seen in recent years is this miniseries from Netflix called The Queen's Gambit, starring Anna Taylor-Joy as this fictional character named Beth Harmon, who eventually grew up to become the #1 ranked chess player in the world. But in order to fully appreciate the theological import of this series, you need to know something about Paul's letter to the Ephesians chapter 5, which for my money is one of the most controversial and misunderstood passages in the entire Bible. And so for those of you who aren't immediately familiar with Ephesians chapter 5, it goes something like this. Wives, be subordinate or submissive to your husbands, as to the Lord. And then later on, husbands, you must love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now, as you probably know, whenever this particular letter shows up in the context of the lectionary, the reader has the option of reading the shorter version or the longer version. The shorter version, of course, omitting this particular passage from Ephesians chapter 5. That said, the thing I want to impress upon you is that this particular passage from Ephesians chapter 5, quite apart from being something which should be omitted or downplayed because it's seen as being disrespectful towards women, is actually one of the most beautiful passages in the entire Bible in terms of what it says about the proper relationship between men and women. Now, on that note, there's this really great American priest named Father John Ricardo who has this really great commentary in Ephesians chapter 5, in which he says, amongst many things, that the word subordinate, again, as in wives be subordinate to your husbands, literally means to place under. And he says that it doesn't convey a sense of oppression or domination for basically two reasons. First of all, because the word which is rendered here subordinate is also used to describe Christ's relationship with his Father by St. Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians chapter 15. So clearly, again, it can't denote a sense of oppression and domination. But the second reason why we notice this in the case is because the grammatical context in which this word actually shows up in Ephesians chapter 5 implies something that is done to oneself, as opposed to something which someone does unto you. And on top of that, and again, this is from Father John Ricardo, the only commandment given in the letter is actually to the husband, not the wife. And the commandment is specifically to love one's wife. And not in a superficial sort of way, but out of a stance of sacrificial love. Mindful of the fact that how Christ actually loved the church was that he actually died for the church. And so given all that, perhaps we may say that the more accurate way to translate this particular passage from Ephesians chapter 5 is to basically say this. Wives, as persons equal in dignity to your husbands, freely choose now to entrust yourselves to their loving care. In other words, the whole idea behind Ephesians chapter 5 is that the husbands, again, following the commandment of the Lord, willingly choose to lay down their lives out of love for their wives, in response to which their wives willingly choose to entrust themselves to their husband's care, as a result of which the world is moved by this example of mutual self-gift and are inspired to do the same, beginning with the children in the family, but then extending, of course, to the rest of the world. And that, again, from the theological perspective, is the Christian notion of marriage, which, of course, is supposed to actively reflect the spousal love between Christ and his church. Now, to illustrate the point, the example that immediately comes to mind, quite apart from the Queen's Gambit, is this really great reflection by this person named Sister Miriam James Highland, who is a member of the Sisters of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity and also a recurring guest star on Ascension Presents. And so basically what Sister Miriam does is this extended meditation, if you will, on this really great sculpture of the Holy Family called The Quiet Moment by Timothy Schmaltz, which basically depicts Mary being held in this tender embrace by St. Joseph with the Christ child at the center. And among the many beautiful things that Sister Miriam says about the sculpture is the fact that St. Joseph is depicted as completely giving his heart over to Mary and holding her in his masculine embrace, as a result of which Mary comes to develop a really deep sense of peace, safety, and tender receptivity, which in turn allows the Christ child again to rest peacefully and tenderly on her very heart. And of course, what is this but the very image of Trinitarian love itself, where the Father pours himself out for the sake of the Son pours himself out for the sake of the Father, and the love between them is so palpable and so intense that it forms a third person, the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete. Okay, but that brings us now to the primary subject of the video, this miniseries again called The Queen's Gambit, which is set in the 1950s and 60s and is based on this 1983 novel of the same name by this guy named Walter Tevis. But you see, what's interesting about this particular series is that even though it's obviously about chess, and in particular the rise of this Beth Harmon character to the status of the #1 ranked chess player in the world, on a deeper level, it's all about this young woman learning in the context of the 1950s and 60s how to navigate through a world of men, and all the various pitfalls and issues related to that problem. And so, for example, at the very beginning of the series, Beth Harmon, when she's still a young girl, is almost killed by her own mother, when her mother decides in a fit of suicidal despair to drive headfirst into some oncoming truck when her daughter is still in the vehicle, after years of neglect and abuse by the various men in her life. And as a result of this early childhood trauma, Beth first of all finds herself in an all-girls orphanage, but then later on she comes to develop this deep sense of distrust and self-protection in her various relationships with men. As a result of which she becomes really sullen and never smiles. She develops an early addiction to drugs and alcohol, and on top of that, all her relationships with men become really superficial and almost entirely physical. Now, of course, as the series progresses, Beth quickly finds that she has a great affinity for the game of chess, which becomes sort of an escape, if you will, from her otherwise painful life, which is bolstered by her really unique ability to imagine the game of chess playing out on a ceiling in the context of her imagination, which she believes for the longest time can only be induced by the use of drugs and alcohol, which of course only serves to reinforce this already terrible habit. In any case, Beth continues to rise to the ranks of this male-dominated culture of chess tournaments, all the while continuing to struggle with this endless cycle of pain, distrust, self-isolation, and self-medication, until the people in her life eventually come to love her in an unselfish sort of way, and she learns to actually receive that love, beginning with her childhood friendships, but then eventually extending to her various male relationships in her life. And what's interesting is that in the context of the series, this particular dynamic actually plays out in the context of this climactic chess game that's being played out in Russia between Beth Harmon and this fictional grandmaster, this guy named Vasily Borgov. And so basically what happens is that during the first day of playing, Borgov decides to adjourn their match, such that it's basically scheduled to resume on the very next day. But in the meantime, Beth gets a really unexpected call from America, from the various men in her life, including her various ex-boyfriends, all of whom happen to be really proficient in the game of chess. So what they tell her is that they've been following the game in the newspaper, such that they have now come together in a really unselfish way to basically help this girl that they love actually win the game. Now, the very next day, the game finally resumes, and Beth initially finds that the advice she's been given actually is helping her to win. But then Borgov makes a really unexpected move, such that Beth is forced to win on her own, if you will. So what ends up happening is that Beth takes a moment to recollect herself, and then she realizes that she's able to visualize again the game playing out on the ceiling, although this time without the help of drugs and alcohol, as a result of which she's able to see the path of victory before finally claiming it. Now, for my money, the way this particular scene plays out is actually quite beautiful. First of all, because it shows that Beth clearly has the innate ability to win the championship, thereby avoiding a mistaken impression that she only won through the help of her friends. But secondly, the scene actually shows that Beth's innate ability is actually awakened, if you will, once she develops a sense of safety and security in her relationships, particularly her relationships with men, which points to the fact that by the conclusion of the series, Beth has finally overcome her long-standing sense of fear and defensiveness. And in fact, this final resolution in Beth's heart finally gives rise to this really great scene at the end of the series. And so basically in the aftermath of her victory over Borgov, Beth is being driven back to the airport, escorted by this government agent. But when she feels that she's being pressured to become this pawn, if you will, in service of the government to serve their political ends, she asks to leave the vehicle and walk on her own, thereby affirming that she's no longer willing to become a pawn in service of men and their needs. But you see, what's interesting is that on top of that, she also shows that she's not afraid of men anymore, as a result of which she's able to freely walk into this nearby park filled with all sorts of elderly men who are playing the game of chess. And instead of being intimidated by them when they start to mob her as a result of their recognition of her being world champion, she smiles because she's free, and because she's living now out of a deep sense of receptivity, which finally allows her to sit across from this one elderly gentleman, to be with him, to smile at him, and to say to him in a total sense of freedom and equality, "Let's play." And may God bless you all.